All right, I'm Dan Harrer. I'm with the Jack Harrer Foundation. Something that I started after my father passed away, but it's not something that I've come into since then. It's something that I got to live with and through my entire life. My father discovered cannabis at the age of 30 years old, at which time I discovered it at the young age of 10 years old. I didn't understand what it was at the time, but I knew that there was a change in our family's life. So the Jack Harrer Foundation today really tries to reintroduce the history that has been unwritten, removed, and in some cases attempt to be destroyed. My father, when he discovered cannabis, was about 15 years before this picture, or excuse me, after this picture. He was a military MP in the Korean War. And when he came back from Korea, he really believed everything that the United States government ever said about cannabis. Everything that Reefer Madness represented, everything that the government put down, everything that was put in newspapers, magazines that talked about Reefer Madness, the destruction of youth. And he believed it to his core. You know, today we're still sort of embroiled in that same system, that same the same ignorance that created prohibition still exists today, even though there's remarkable steps forward that we have had in this country, from state to state to state, changing access to this plant. I don't say cannabis is legal anywhere, because everything that's happening today is still based in the lies and misinformation that prohibition created. So the foundation sort of unravels that. And my father's book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, which I hope most of you got in your packages. I hope that this book that was written 35 years ago, and at the time, it inspired some people, but today I think it's even more relevant today than it was 35 years ago. 35 years ago, we didn't have the technologies available to really explore the things that were said that were possible. And today, the things that are happening nationally, globally, locally, are all becoming part of our lives, whether we bring this plant into our communities and allow businesses to be built. It's all a matter of trying to figure out what disinformation is and what real information is. And by being here at Texas A&M University, by having the cannabis the cannabis policy conference here, it's a huge step for what could happen here in Texas. It is a huge step forward. I just hope that the next steps aren't bogged down in the quagmire of the lies that prohibition and the devastating effects that it's had on communities, including ones right here in Texas.
Yes, sir. There you go.
So when my father discovered cannabis at the age of 30, like many wars that have happened around the globe throughout history, these wars were about women, for women, and many soldiers laid down their lives to prove their love to the things that they felt were important, whether it was Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and in this case my father and the girl who introduced him to cannabis. At the time that this picture was taken, or just before this picture was taken, my father thought that anybody that smoked cannabis was an anti-war protester or just a counterculturist should be taken out and summarily shot. His views on cannabis were fairly extreme. I would say that he would make Jeff Sessions look like a pussycat. But his experience really started when he wanted to date this woman, and he got nowhere. And she says, Jack, you don't know anything about anything. You don't know anything about life. Smoke some cannabis, we'll go out. So he did, after many months of knocking, and that experience changed his life. Literally overnight, he went from the military soldier that you had seen prior to this young cannabis consumer to just 2 years later being one of the initial people that supported Proposition 19 in 1972 in California, which looked to decriminalize cannabis. It got 39% of the vote in California, but it did not pass. But what it did is it put him on a path and this family on a path for the rest of our lives. It has been an exceptional journey for us. And that has really transformed everything that I see and how I've been raised and how I process information with cannabis. OMG. Is there a way that I can just hit a button and this thing stops?
How will I help you? What's behind you, Dan?
All right. What's up, Dad? So from this, he became an activist. You know, it's not the same as today's advocate. Today, we advocate for something that we use and we try to communicate a way forward. But back then, activism was just, I don't want to go to jail. I'm going to do everything that I can to change this. So in 1972, he met this gentleman standing next to him. His name is Captain Ed Adair. He opened up one of the very first cannabis paraphernalia shops in the United States, in Van Nuys, California. They became lifelong friends, and they spent the rest of each of their lives fighting for the truth about cannabis and the end of prohibition. They made a pact to one another that they would spend every day of their life until everybody that was been imprisoned for cannabis was either free, prohibition was over, or they turned 83. And unfortunately, neither made it to that ripe old age of 83. But during their life, they changed how we see this plant today. And it is still changing. It is still really creating new understandings and new opportunities. And as a son, I'm always forever grateful for that. From 1980 to 2001, we had an event booth down on Venice Beach, California, which talked about the history of cannabis. And this was something really novel in the 80s, that somebody would be standing out, proclamating from a street corner the truth of cannabis and the story of its past, not from prohibition, but long before. So as we go back into history, the pyramids in Egypt depict this character. Her name is Seshat. She is the Egyptian god of mathematics, accounting, creativity, and free thinking. Above her head is depicted a cannabis leaf under a dome. I don't have an understanding completely of what that dome is, but I think it has a lot to do with the trichome that that globe above or on our cannabis plants. But for sure, it is the cannabis plant that is above our head. And this was something that they also presented to the gods. Well, nope, it's not there. But she's not just depicted in one, she's not just depicted in one image, she's depicted throughout the hieroglyphics amongst the pyramids. Now, there's discussion on whether it's 8,000 years old or 50,000 years old, but we know that this plant has been here for much, much longer than we have. So as cannabis became a crop that we recognized and we used every day, it was everything to all communities, not just what's happening here in the United States today, but globally, every single country that had agriculture, development of products that their communities would use, whether it was food, whether it was housing, whether it was their clothing or paper, cannabis was that. It was their medicine. It was the food for their animals through the hemp seed. It was, in this case, this was the engine that powered the world and being able to circumnavigate it. It was the ropes, the riggings, the books, the maps. It was everything that a country needed in order to explore the world. And it was not powered by diesel engine. It was powered by this plant that we all are gravitating toward today. Being able to move around the world we were able to take commerce, take cannabis, its different genetics, and acclimate them to new surroundings, to new countries, creating new varieties and new opportunities for all mankind. This wasn't something that was feared. This was something that was revered. It was something that every country on the planet used to make their country stronger. It gave them strength. It gave them safety. It gave them a way to generate commerce by creating its products and to protect their borders through ships of war and through the use of this even as gunpowder. It was grown in great length and detail in virtually every climate, whether it was mountainous, whether it was flat terrain. And then, you know, and as it became necessary, and especially here in the United States, prior to us becoming the United States, it was the thing that we knew that we needed in order to become independent from, you know, what we perceived as British dominance and our, you know, being under the thumb of Europe. So at a time where Thomas Jefferson, excuse me, was an attaché to these new colonies and to the burgeoning United States, before he was president, he would actually smuggle cannabis seeds out of Europe, out of China, through Eastern Europe and to the United States in order to give us the opportunity to grow our own clothing, our own oils, our own ways to light our lamps, to create the oils for our wagons. And so when you hear the terms, you know, canvas covered wagons came west, or ships that sailed the sea, canvas is a Dutch pronunciation of cannabis. So throughout history, canvas is cannabis. So when we go into museums today, when we explore our own history as a culture, not just as a country, but canvas was absolutely the most necessary crop. It was the most valuable crop for all nations, because you couldn't create an armada of ships without hemp, because that was its power. That is what propelled commerce globally. As the 1800s started, we started making more cordage, more products that for living here in the United States, from our clothing to our drapes to our bedding to our carpets and everything that we used within this country in order to stand apart and not be, subjugated to what was coming from Europe. We could create our own economies, our own independence. And that's what it helped to do. From gunpowder to medicines, it gave us freedom. As time started to change and we started realizing that the products that came from cannabis were valuable, there was a new find in the 1800s called oil. And I realize I'm standing in Texas, but it's a necessary step in our development as mankind, is understanding what we use, how we use them. And it was a really powerful time in our country, and it gave us opportunities to choose one way of moving forward opposed to another. And at the time, oil was incredibly inexpensive to harvest opposed to hemp. Hemp was incredibly hard to manage, to harvest. It took tens of thousands of man hours just to process a single crop, not at the scale of what was necessary in order to have an affordable product for a market. And oil became a very usable source of creating new products, everything from nylons to polymers like polyesters, things that could be made cheaply, could be made fast, and companies took advantage of that and created an incredible industrial revolution. But at the same time, as it was developing as a competing crop against oil, there was a shift in the United States government, and they started looking, and in fact, that brings us back to Texas A&M. The United States Department of Agriculture in 1916 put out a memo called Bulletin 404. Bulletin 404 said that the use of hemp for paper making material should replace trees for paper future forward, because 1 acre of hemp could produce as much of that paper as 4 acres of trees. This sent shockwaves through many, many industries. These industries included William Randolph Hearst's paper. His paper industry, from newspapers from the East Coast to the West Coast, were all supplied by tree farming that came from his personal land holdings. At the same time, DuPont was producing a sulfuric acid product that would take the tree pulp, turn it into paste, and allow that to become paper. But in 1915, a German engineer created a new way to process hemp that would actually start making it competitive for the use for paper. And that frightened industries that were already building huge net worths and fortunes and investors in these companies. And this started a chain reaction that still affects us today. The things that affect us are things like Reefer Madness. In the room just before I came in here, they were talking about how many legislations or legislators within their counties, within their state, or even at the federal government still look to Reefer Madness as the blueprint for why prohibition exists. But in reality, these were created to demonize that competition to the things like tree pulp and oil use for clothing and other products. So the creation of Reefer Madness, the stories that led behind them, that came behind them, that really started to create this narrative that this was a plant that needed to be literally removed. It needed to be eliminated literally from this planet. It needed to not exist because it was a absolute and direct threat to the future of all of these companies producing their profits. In fact, Dow, Dow actually said that they saw over the next 50 years that the process for paper manufacturing would be at least 50% of their future profits. So their shareholders wouldn't be pleased if cannabis came in and none of that technology was used in the creation of paper. You know, whether it was a directly intentional to create prohibition, they didn't know that this product was absolutely the most disruptive technology to their businesses as they knew. So in 1937, the Cannabis Tax Act was passed. Hemp and cannabis were made illegal with a little bit less than 90 seconds on the floor of the federal government. And with no further thought, cannabis, the most important crop to this country, was made illegal. Where most people didn't understand that cannabis and hemp were one of the same. When they made marijuana illegal, they also made hemp illegal. And most people never even knew it until after the fact. And then they were like, well, we've been growing this for, you know, hundreds of years. We've been growing this for generations on our family farms. What do we do now? For the federal government, 5 years later, that turned around and kind of bit us all in the butt, because World War II started and we had no hemp in this country. We had no hemp for our backpacks, for our soldiers, for the webbing, for our parachutes, for the belts that would carry our supplies, for the ropes and riggings that would be needed on the ships, you know, and a host of other products that were used and intended for the war effort. So they actually, in 1942, legalized cannabis once again, and even created a propaganda film called Hemp for Victory. This film was made by the United States Department of Agriculture for the Department of Defense. And for the first time since the 1920s and going through Reefer Madness, the government actually spoke the truth about this 14-minute film that was given and shared with all 4-H clubs, all farmers around the country, and encouraged them to grow up to 500,000 acres of hemp each year during the war. It was an extraordinary time. At the same time, this would be Henry Ford. And Henry Ford in the 1940s started working with biomass products and created a biomass-based car that ran on biofuel, of which part was hemp. The interior parts of this vehicle were hemp, and the body was made of hemp polymers. It turned out to be 10 times stronger than steel. Especially during World War II, steel was at a premium. But with that being said, Ford also had a contract with the federal government to produce products for the war, and this car got shelved. Today, car industries have come back around, and maybe unbeknownst to many of you, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, since about 2002 had started making their interior parts with hemp products like this door panel, dashes, consoles, still do today. They're made through a company called Hemp Flax out of Holland. And their products are, you know, if you drive a BMW, if you drive a Mercedes, if you drive a Range Rover, or even a Bugatti, many of these interior parts are made with cannabis today. One of the other things that was hugely problematic at the turn of the century, which applies to right now, and how we're dealing with legalization and access to cannabis, you know, is that virtually every single pharmaceutical company today that existed in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, that put out products, put out cannabis-based products for virtually every ailment, from corns on your feet to menstrual cycle, you know, sensitivities, to aches and pains, to not being able to sleep, to insomnia, and virtually everything today. Now, today, we're fighting whether even one or two things of the human condition can be applied to the access for this plant. And I think right now, Texas is still having a hard time figuring out, you know, who can get access to this medicine and what causes may be that thing that says, yes, you can. But back then it was everything. It was given in some cases back then to children. It was given to adults. It was given to the elderly for everything from arthritis to, you know, basic aches and pains, to stomach ailments. The one thing that they couldn't do, and why so many made the same type of product, is because there was no patentability. You couldn't patent a plant, so they couldn't take this plant and say, this is mine. So when synthetics were starting to be developed in the early 1900s, cannabis medicines like these were dropping off because these other processes could be patented. They could be limited to the use and production from only a single company. So cannabis itself became disruptive to the pharma industry because you couldn't control what could be used with cannabis. So, and if that was going to be your competitor in the pharma market, then, you know, you really need to eliminate this competitor. And they were only too happy to start jumping in on what prohibition meant and how it was used. 1970, excuse me. Richard Nixon created the Controlled Substance Act, which gave us our Schedule I. At the time that this was signed, he was trying to figure out how he could eliminate those that were protesters, these hippies, these pot smokers, from being, you know, potentially disruptive to his campaigns and to future campaigns. And he signed this in an effort to, unfortunately, incarcerate and further develop what would be the Prohibition Acts going back as early as 1937. It was made to, in a sense, take away anybody's right that had been arrested for the possession, the use of this controlled substance, take their voice away. Through this, he also started studies of how dangerous this plant was. Unfortunately, the universities that were founded, that founded their drug policy conferences or drug policy studies, found out that cannabis didn't create or cause aches, pains, cancer, death, that in fact it helped in all of these things. That everything that he was trying to prove with these university studies actually came back positive for what cannabis could do. And at that time, he then signed a law that said that there would be no further study of cannabis in the United States, and eliminated any research, with the exception of universities that would do research that would only focus on negative aspects using incredibly arcane practices that would give the cause and effect that they were looking to be able to put out in publications. So when they were talking about cannabis kills brain cells, they didn't tell you that when they were doing the studies on monkeys, that they would deprive the monkeys of oxygen at the same time they were using the cannabis, therefore brain cell death. So the studies didn't have any merit, but they had the loudest megaphone. They had the largest voice, and we didn't. But in 1985, let's see what we got after this. Well, I'll go to this anyway right now. So in 1985, after 15 years of study, my father wrote this book. It wasn't quite as thick as it is today, but at the time it was incredibly instrumental in allowing people to hear and see the truth of cannabis throughout our history as Americans. And it, for the first time, gave a voice to somebody who had thoughts of what cannabis was, about what it could be, and about how we used it and how we depended on it at one time in our lives. But now we were having to fight for it. And it gave people for the first time a way to find their voice and to stand up in the communities and really start fighting forward on how to change prohibition and how to shine the light on the truth. I hope all of you got a copy in your bags. I hope that you take the time to read it. In 1985, it changed a lot of lives. In 2022, it has the opportunity to change many, many more, because today it's actually more relevant than it was in 1985. We didn't have the ability to explore all of the opportunities that this plant actually gave us until the technologies and the access to the plant itself became available to us. And today we are excelling around the world in cannabis understanding, cannabis opportunities, cannabis science, and a truly cannabis future. Whether you believe in cannabis or not, the fact that this plant is being used in our daily lives every day improves everybody's life on this planet, whether you choose to use it, whether you choose to smoke it, whether you choose to wear it, whether you choose to smoke it, whether you choose to wear it on your skin. It changes lives. And that's a beautiful thing. So we've also been faced with how information is changed or disseminated, or in some cases eliminated. At the Library of Congress, you would think that everything in there would be the history of us, the history of the world, that is all, captured and created in these volumes and volumes of information of literary artists, facts, documents. But that's not always the truth. The film Hemp for Victory, after it was made, the federal government, years after the war, said that they didn't know what anybody was talking about. What film, Hemp for Victory? We didn't make it. My father in 1980s found a reel of it, turned it into VHS tapes and gave them away or sold them to help fund cannabis, the ending of cannabis prohibition across the United States. This film raised a lot of interest in what he was doing and what he was saying, both pro and con. He was then called a fraud in that he was a bootleg filmmaker that actually created this false film to make the government look bad. He knew that he didn't make it. He was upset of being called a fraud because my father was a very principled person. Spent a week at the Library of Congress, and in doing so, going into the deepest bowels of this institution, was able to find original copy of the film, documents between the United States Department of Ag and the United States Department of Defense talking about the production of this film. Took that information back upstairs, asked for the right paperwork, And this film was reinstated into the Library of Congress in the early 1990s and is part of the historical record there today. Now, if you go back to the screen for a second, there's also there's also the Smithsonian Institute. The Smithsonian Institute is supposed to be, in a sense, the bastion of American culture, from everything about where we came to what we do to, you know, the TV show Friends. It's all there. It's all who we are. But when you go back into historical products in the 1700s, the 1800s, when you go back in, they're talking about what a garment was made out of, whether it was silk or whether it was wool. It would say, oh, these were silks from China that were used in this, and this was, you know, wool, you know, coverings for, you know, couches. But anything, including our soldiers' uniforms from the 17 and 1800s, it says other material. There's no declaration of what the product was made from, of what those uniforms, those soldiers' jackets, the clothing were made from. Literally like it didn't exist. Today, we still need to change that narrative. We need to re-embrace our understanding and keep from hiding the truth of cannabis. Not just from ourselves, but from the future, you know, our future selves. And it is incumbent upon us at institutions like this, at Texas A&M University, the studies that are going on with hemp and hemp understanding, from its properties to make foods or animal feed or clothing or homes, that we start doing things with the truth at hand, instead of trying to unravel a lie with another lie. You know, you can't change prohibition and regulate it if you're using prohibition as the foundation for the lie that you created, and are now trying to end because you don't want to admit the lies. You want to just change it just enough to make it acceptable. You know, the problem with lies is that you can't tell them forever. At some point, whether it's 10 years or 50 years, or in this case, you know, 80 plus years of prohibition, the truth is out. Cannabis is the future. It is how we are going to live in a future, not just survive in it, but thrive in it, if we're allowed to use this plant to its full utility. It is an amazing opportunity for us as humans, as Americans, as part of this civilized world that this plant grows all around, that we embrace it and use it to every way that we can, to change how we're living, to change what our air looks like, to change what our soil is, to change what our water is. All of these things are incumbent upon us, and what we learn and what we do with what we've learned. So one of those things is housing. Industry. This is something that touches every one of our lives. This is a hemp home. It uses 60% less energy than a home that is currently constructed today. It is thermally efficient. It is strong. It is virtually fireproof, with the exception of some of the wood that's used within its structure of walls. But you can literally take a torch to the wall of a hemp home, leave it on there for 15, 20, 30 minutes, an hour, and there will be no scar. There will be no ignition point to carry that any further than the point of impact for that torch or that flame. What it really comes down to is, you know, learn what you can, embrace the opportunities that you have in front of you, I really do. Again, I encourage you all to read this book. It may be 35 years old, but it will change more lives today than it did 35 years ago, because today we have a much greater capacity to understand once something that we once feared to now that's something that we could truly embrace with our hearts, our souls. If you really want to know what the most addictive thing about cannabis is, the most addicting thing is the opportunities that we have to work with it and how it actually helps the lives of all of us. It's not about the fact that I can consume it, that I can smoke it. It is not that. It is how it gives us the understanding of how we get to live our futures. And by doing that, we can get through prohibition. Texas can have an understanding and access to a plant that benefits everybody in the state, whether they use it or not, because the people that get to engage in the commerce of cannabis will be employed. They will pay taxes. They will take care of their families. They will donate to their churches. They will buy goods and services at stores and so on. The economic impact of what cannabis is and does for a community is truly uplifting. No pun intended. It is a way for us to literally lift up the communities that we live and grow and love and support. And if that community is here in College Station, or whether it's in Houston, or whether it's in Oklahoma, or whether it's in Kansas, wherever that community is, this community grows. And it's, if you look at what's happening around the world today, Thailand has legalized cannabis. France is using levels of cannabis and hemp today. Germany is importing cannabis today. Eastern Europe is growing and using cannabis. South America is embracing the opportunities that cannabis provides. And the funny thing is today is that every one of these countries that are re-embracing this plant are countries that had used this plant their entire lives, going back hundreds or thousands of years. This is not something new, but it is something to be renewed within these communities. And I hope that after reading this book and hearing all of the incredible speakers that are here, that like my father, like myself, you find a way to find your voice and stand up and fight for the freedom of this plant and the community that loves it. So thank you so much. I appreciate all of your time. And if anybody has any questions, I believe that there'll be a mic coming around.
I just wanted to see if you would, if you had an answer for this, especially since you finished by talking about all these other countries that are starting to re-embrace the plant. How did it go from us like sort of smearing this crop to being like a worldwide? Did it just seem that like the other countries were following suit, or was there something else more nefarious going on? Or
I can tell you it didn't happen through governmental influence. Unfortunately, we are now a society of money and opportunity. Many of these countries saw what was happening in California, saw what was happening in the medical communities or in the cannabis communities that started offering medical access around the United States, and realized that this plant that they had already previously grown in these countries, they already knew it not to be dangerous. But every one of these countries were subsidized by the United States of America after the Single Convention Act of 1961. So up until then, there was a lot of countries that still embraced cannabis, still grew cannabis, still used it. And with the Single Convention Act, with the stroke of a pen, being able to join the United Nations, that countries literally gave up their own history in order to feel safe by this creation of the United Nations and abide by the United States laws on drugs. Today, across the United States, the acceleration of access to cannabis in different communities, although it is being fought by activists to bring awareness to the needs of children, adults, for health benefits, the fact is that all cannabis use is medicinal. If you're not sick and you're using cannabis and it lowers your stress and it makes you feel happy and you're laughing, this is a wonderful thing to have. This is a wonderful thing to experience. And this in itself gives you health, helps you to feel better about everything from your environment to the ones you love to the things that you get to do. If you're, impacted by, disease, cancer, glaucoma, muscular sclerosis, muscular dystrophy, all of these diseases, PTSD, that we know from personal use, not necessarily scientific proven anything, because this has again been removed from our way of studying and researching for decades and decades and decades. But we've all known, as folks that have maybe used hemp or used cannabis, we know the power of this plant without having to be scientifically told that it will improve your situation. Today, access is really starting to be generated by cities, by states, because they don't want to miss out on the ability to extort from the industry for which they once loathed. And they take their steps through excessive tax, through excessive, structures in order for us to produce this. But nevertheless, during that same time, they make sure that you cannot profit from it as a business, but that they can profit from it by taking what it is that you earn for them. It is a very dangerous situation when we start talking about cannabis access, and certainly cannabis legalization. Because all of that, if it's still based in the premise of what prohibition said was the truth, then we're already doing the wrong things. I hope that answers some of what you asked. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Given all what you are saying about the benefits of the plant and
Yes, ma'am.
the lack of scientific reports on those benefits, is it not interesting, or what do you think is preventing the scientific community and people advocating for this plan to put a lot of efforts to prove scientifically, like with other alternatives, that this is what is happening, right? In studies that can show that, and just to back up those anecdotals, because I think that's what you're trying to say, right? That there are anecdotals
Right.
reference for people.
We know from personal experience.
Exactly, but that's if it's this scientific proof or this scientific evidence is lacking, what is preventing to do that? And it is what do you need to do, or the community needs to do to press more on doing that? And my other question is, since it seems the benefits just not on that direction, but on the general industry, like for cars, houses, for all that that the hemp plant has, what does this plant has that makes it so useful in that industry as compared to some other plants? Because it seems like a marvelous plant, right? But what it makes it unique for all those applications? Those two questions.
Wow. Okay, well, the study of cannabis and its attributes were ended in the 1970s under the Nixon administration. So universities technically don't have the ability to do the research that you're talking about. Now, there are universities that exist within states that have access or are willing to forego federal laws prohibiting such. And because they are in these states where the state has said that there's access to this plant, and the universities have worked out an understanding with the state as to not disrespect the Controlled Substance Act, especially if they're involved in government funding, which many campuses are, that things are greatly altered as to what you can do. One of the reasons why there's such a pushback on actually doing, human trials or really significant scientific research is because the truth about this plant and how miraculous it is, because there are so many things, as you've said, and I'll get to that in a minute. This plant, for better or worse, is the most disruptive technology that we've ever come in contact with as a human civilization. This plant and its properties, whether it's the fiber from the hemp, whether it's the nutrition from its seed, whether it's the medical benefits of its flower, all of these things affect industries that have been going on for 130 years, 150 years. And for these industries to suddenly shift their ideas of how they're going to move into the future, it is incredibly disruptive to everything, including their profitability. The fiber is the strongest of any plant. It grows in more geographic areas around the world than virtually any plant. But it's all of its components of what makes the plant, its oils, its terpenes, its fiber, its flower, can be made into not just one thing or 5 things or 10 things, but tens of thousands of things. The properties of this plant and the chemicals that it can create plastics that are biodegradable. It can create housing that is virtually indestructible. It can create medicines that don't damage other parts of your body because you ingest it. It is incredibly valuable. Its seed has the highest levels of linolenic and linoleic acids, which our bodies need. These are essential fatty acids that our bodies need and do not make. We take that in through nutrition, through nuts, through fish, through other things like omega-3s, omega-6s. This plant and its properties has the ability to sustain life just as it is, which I don't know of another plant that has these properties. So the use of it is incredibly important. The study of it is even more important. The fact that we're not able to use it as a springboard to the future right now is really more political and financial than it is the will or the resources to get it done. Did that answer both questions? All right. You have a question, sir? Anybody else? I would think that it probably happened sometime after 1937. Well, if you were denouncing something that you didn't want to be known, you would think that it would have probably happened during the transition of something that we used in our everyday life and it was available through Sears to something that was demonized, that if you smoked this plant and if you used it, you would kill your family and jump out a window.
It's interesting because the Smithsonian is
Respected?
sort of, they're known for being active.
Well, so would the Library of
That's the whole
Congress.
thing. Yeah.
You know, so the truth only suits most people until it doesn't suit them. Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you all very much.